Hello, my friends. Today's the day where iambs, dactyls, anapests, and more assemble here to play. It's good to see you. I hope you've had a lovely week. A little while ago, we started talking about poetic meter by discussing the shadowy secrets of syllables and syllable stress, which are both essential for understanding syllabic and accentual verse. But most of the famous verse forms you've probably heard of don't just count syllables or stresses. Instead, they count both and are known as Accentual-Syllabic verse, and today is our day to get to know them. So let's get on with it. Like with syllabic and accentual verse, accentual-syllabic verse is a game of counting that involves keeping track of the number of syllables and stresses in a given line. So, for example, if you spend any time reading the work of a writer like Shakespeare or his contemporaries, you'll notice that most of his lines have 10 syllables, and that those lines generally have 5 stressed syllables. But then you'll also notice that those stressed syllables happen at regular intervals. Shakespeare isn't just writing 10-syllable lines with 5 stresses wherever they happen to show up. Instead, there's a fairly reliable pattern of alternating stressed and unstressed syllables. And that's because accentual-syllabic verse is built out of what metricists call feet, the basic unit of this kind of verse. A foot is built out of some combination of stressed and unstressed syllables, and lines of accentual-syllabic verse are built out of repeated feet. Oh, and before we get too far, unstressed syllables are represented like this, and stressed syllables are represented like this. In other words, Shakespeare's verse is counting syllables and stresses, but it's doing it by counting feet. In this case, iambic feet, which consist of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So these 10-syllable lines are actually composed of 5 2-syllable iambic feet. As a result, we get a back-and-forth alternating rhythm between stressed and unstressed syllables, a pattern that repeats 5 times per line. And of course, if you've ever heard somebody talk about iambic pentameter, this is it. Meters are identified first by the kind of feet that they're mostly composed of, and then by the number of feet that occur in each line. So if we had lines made with just one iamb each, we would have iambic monometer. Add another foot and we'd have iambic dimeter, then trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, and you could keep going, but most people don't. Whatever kind of accentual-syllabic verse you're working with, this is the classification you'll use. Name the kind of foot you're primarily working with, and we'll name some of the more common ones here in a bit, and then count the number of feet per line. And if you've got that, you're good to go. Although it is wise to put a few asterisks in place, because after all, this is an art, not a science. First, the language of metrics is borrowed from ancient Greek poetry. So when you adapt a system developed for one language into a language that works in a different way, there are bound to be some eccentricities, and this is just our lot in life. Second, you may occasionally notice words or syllables that appear to be out of place. You might, for example, notice an unstressed syllable sitting where you might expect a stressed syllable in a line of iambic verse. When that happens, remember one of two things. First, patterns speak louder than words. So a word might sound stressed when you say it in isolation, but when it's stuck between two words with relatively greater stress, it will sound unstressed in comparison. And of course, second, remember that poets are an unruly bunch, and they may sometimes take artistic liberties by substituting in a different kind of foot in a line. And finally, there are some cases in which words can be stressed in multiple ways, maybe because they have different meanings, like with record and record, or because of some kind of regional variation like advertisement versus advertisement. But these kinds of variations in stresses are relatively rare. While there is some give in stress placement, word stress overall is much less squishy than beginning metricists often assume. So avoid the temptation to invent unnatural pronunciations just to make a word fit into a stress pattern. Just because you can say a word in more than one way doesn't mean that that word is actually said in more than one way. When you've repeated the word too many times and it's lost all meaning, consult a good dictionary. It will show you where the stresses should go, and more often than not, there will only be one possible answer. Anyway, that's enough about meter in general. Let's get to know some of the more famous feet that are out there. If you're working with two-syllable feet, you're working in Duple Meter, and if that's the case, you really have two options for feet and a couple of minor variations. We've already talked about iambs. These feet are built out of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. For a long time, iambic pentameter was the go-to form for poets working in English, and I remember a professor once saying that it was the quintessential form of the language, that its patterns mimicked the natural rhythms of English speech, and that its line was just long enough to be said with a single breath. Of course, that's the kind of goofy and overly romanticized nonsense that gets poets and critics in trouble, as if everyone had the same lung capacity. But iambic pentameter does have a long history, and it comes with all of the associations and baggage that the de facto default form of a language would be expected to have. Now, I have no quarrel with iambic pentameter, but I do tend to hear longer lines as being slower, heavier, and maybe steadier, while shorter lines are livelier and more energetic. So while there's nothing wrong with iambic pentameter, I'd much rather hear iambic tetrameter, which is just to say that when you're writing with iambs, don't feel like you have to do the traditional thing and write in pentameter. Metrical poetry is pretty traditional, and iambic pentameter is as traditional as it gets. So why not liven things up with something other than a 5-foot line? Anyhow, flip an iamb around and you'll end up with a trochee, which is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Trochaic meters are sometimes associated with nursery rhymes. So while iambic meters have all the stateliness of the literary canon behind them, trochees come sometimes with the energy of childhood. After all, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water with 2 trochaic feet apiece, which may have wrecked their balance. Now, is the trochee nursery rhyme link a rule? Of course not, but it is common enough that it may trigger some of those associations for your reader. Of course, writing in trochees does not mean that you have to write kid stuff, though. For example, I remember writing a parody or reimagining of Milton's Paradise Lost in college, and I thought, as long as I was changing things around, that it would be fun to write in trochees instead of Milton's iambs. And at the time, I thought I was awfully clever. For better or worse, though, that piece no longer survives. Now, in addition to iambs and trochees, you'll find 2 other kinds of duple feet, but you'll never find entire poems written with them because, of course, it's impossible to write in exclusively stressed or unstressed syllables. A foot composed of 2 stressed syllables is known as a spondee, and you'll occasionally see it in the place of a regular foot in a line of trochaic or iambic verse. Because, sometimes the occasion just calls for the unrelenting heaviness of 2 stressed syllables in a row. Or perhaps you'll encounter 2 unstressed syllables, in which case you've found a pyrrhic foot, which is just another of the possible variations in duple meter. Again, poetic meter is more of an art than a science. It is possible to write perfect, unwavering lines of iambic pentameter or trochaic trimeter, but then you run the risk of metrical monotony. So you're not breaking the rules if you deviate from the pattern with an occasional substitution or inversion. Instead, you're infusing the form with a little artistic variety. But enough about duple meters, let's move on to the fun stuff. Contemporary poets who write with traditional forms will often do a lot to mute their effect or to make them less obtrusive or audible. That's easier to do with duple meters, but that's no reason to avoid triple meters or meters with 3-syllable feet. Since there are 3 syllables in a triple metered foot, there are more possible combinations of stressed and unstressed syllables. However, like with duple meters, there are really 2 primary triple meters, and other kinds of feet are more often seen as variations or substitutions here and there. If you're writing with feet consisting of a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables, you're working with dactylic meter, which sounds something like this. Dactyls are metrical marvels that might make you feel like you're waltzing along as you read. Where the goal is to avoid breaking out into song, triple meter poses an interesting challenge. The pattern is more distinctive and less natural than duple meter, so even when you're not hamming it up like I am, it's easy to fall into the sing-songy overt drone of the meter. But honestly, where the goal is just to have symmetrical fun, who cares? If nothing else, dactyls are just fun to read aloud. And the same can be said of anapests, which are the inverse of dactyls, two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. And an anapest flips the dactylic approach as it gallops along, leaving waltzing behind. Now, it's hard to know whether my sense of the waltzing and galloping feel of these meters is just a deeply embedded consequence of how I was first introduced to them, but the fact remains that I tend to hear dactyls as being more measured and deliberate, with anapests seeming to run over themselves as the line progresses. Of course, if you remember from our last video on the topic, English is a stress-timed language, which means that stressed syllables will fall at fairly regular intervals in natural speech. So, adding unstressed syllables to triple meter will naturally give it an accelerated feel when compared to duple meter. Put those unstressed syllables first, and you're off to the races on your way to the slower stressed syllable at the end of each anapestic foot. Either way, like duple meters, triple meters are measured in feet. So where a line of trochaic trimeter consists of 3 trochaic feet, a line of anapestic tetrameter will consist of 4 anapestic feet for a total of 12 syllables and 4 stresses. And again, like duple meter, with triple meters there are some feet that show up primarily as variations that are less common but no less fun to think about. Put that stressed syllable in the middle of the foot and you have an amphibrachic foot, perhaps most famous for its appearance in the limerick. Or maybe you could double up on the stressed syllables, which may be more difficult to sustain at length, but could add some interesting variety to your triple meter. A foot with 1 unstressed syllable followed by 2 stresses is known as a Bacchius. Flip that around and you get the aptly named Antibacchius. Put the unstressed syllable in the middle and you have a Cretic foot. 3 unstressed syllables is known as a tribrach, and 3 stressed syllables has the appropriately imposing name Molossus. But these are all more likely to be exceptional cases. That is, it's more probable that you'll see lines of dactylic trimeter with the occasional Cretic substitution than to see a poem written in complete lines of Cretic trimeter. Not that it's impossible, just that it's less likely. And of course, it's also possible to discuss feet of 4 syllables, but they don't figure prominently into English metrics. They're not terribly useful if you're just looking to analyze or write English poetry, so I'll leave them for the hopeless enthusiasts like me to investigate on their own. Alright friends, we've talked about a lot today. Greek terminology, numbers, variations of feet, but it's not essential that you memorize any of these things, at least not right away. What is important at this point is to remember that accentual-syllabic verse counts both syllables and stresses, and it does it by counting feet. And those feet are set combinations of stressed and unstressed syllables. Write with 2-syllable feet and you're writing in duple meter, which makes up a significant majority of metrical poetry in English. Write with 3-syllable feet and you're writing in triple meter, which can have a more distinctive and energetic feel than duple meter, but can also pose challenges for those poets who are trying to avoid the sing-songy rhythms of poetry's past. With a basic understanding of syllabic verse, accentual verse, and accentual-syllabic verse, you have everything you need to start writing some solid metrical lines. Of course, with meter under our belts, we've really just begun our journey into the realm of formal poetry, so I hope you'll stay tuned as we move beyond the basics of formal lines. In the meantime, though, have some fun with meter. It's not as popular as it used to be, but that just means you have a great chance to stand out, hopefully in positive ways, with your metrical lines. While you do, I'll look forward to seeing you again for next week's show.